Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar today. I'm Amarachi Azubike, and I'm one of the community managers at She Code Africa. And today we are having day one in the 3-day webinar organized by Women of Open Source Community Africa, popularly known as WOSCA. Women of Open Source Community Africa is a partnership between Open Source Community Africa and She Code Africa, and the mission is to improve inclusion in the open source culture in African countries. So today we are organizing this webinar. It's a 3-day webinar. So today is day one, and the day 2 is on Thursday, and the final day is on Saturday. So it's for 3 days and it's well spaced out. And the purpose of spacing it out is for, for accessibility. We want it to be much more easier for you to attend. So today is day one, Thursday, and then we wrap up the final event on Saturday. So the theme of this webinar is open source, contributing beyond codes. And the purpose of this webinar is to teach you more ways of contributing to open source, even if you do not know how to code, even if you're not a programmer. You have to know that there is no barrier, there is no restraints, there is nothing stopping you from contributing to open source, even with your skill set. So we want to teach you ways you can contribute to open source, even if you do not know how to program. And we have guests lined up for you that will be teaching you ways to do this in this 3 days webinar. All right, so before we get started, I want to say a very big thank you to everybody who made it out to join in this broadcast today. You all are the real MVPs. You can go ahead and share the link to this YouTube stream with your friends, your sisters, and your colleagues who are not able to join yet. Let them know what's happening so they can join and learn 1 or 2 things from today, the day one. And also feel free to share your Twitter, your Facebook, and all the rest. All right, so moving on, I'm going to give a brief introduction to open source. For some of us who do not know what open source is in the first place, it's a good start for you to know what it is before you can start knowing how to contribute even as a non-programmer. Okay, so whenever you hear the term open source, we're talking about open source software rather. We are talking about software that have a form of license that allows users, everyone, you and I, to contribute, modify, or edit the source code and even distribute it, even build your own software right from it. So that is the layman definition of open source. Products and software you can contribute to, you can distribute, you can modify their source code. So this basic definition of open source kind of made it look a lot like something you must know how to program. Remember, it has something like source code somewhere there. So it makes you think that you must know how to program before you can contribute to open source projects. But that is what we are trying to tell you in this 3-day webinar, different ways you can contribute to this product, this software that have their licenses open, where you can contribute with your little skill set as a technical writer, as a designer, as a programmer, as anything tech, you can contribute to open source. And you might be asking, how do I do this? How do I go about this? I have no idea. Where do I get this software from? How do I even start? So today, we are going to get into the first phase of this topic, which is design in open source. As a designer, you might not have heard about open source design before, or you might have, but you don't really know how to, get started. You don't know what to do. You don't know where to get this product you can contribute to. So we are going to be having the first session today, as I said, design in open source, and we have a guest in the house who I'm going to be introducing very soon, and she is the one to be taking us in the next few minutes on how to contribute to open source as a designer. All right, so once again, thank you very much for joining this particular broadcast day one. Feel free to ask your questions during the session. If you have questions, kindly drop them in the comment section. At the end of the talk, we are going to be taking all your questions bit by bit, and we're going to be answering them one after the other. So feel free to ask your questions, any question at all you have about open source designs or how to get started with open source contributions. So we have a guest today, and her name is Peace Ojeme, popularly known as Perry. Peace is a product designer, and she's also the creativity lead at the Open Source Community Africa. She is one designer that has made so much impact in open source. She works with open source projects. In fact, I admire her a whole lot. And sometimes, in fact, she was the one that introduced me to design in open source. I never had an idea such a thing existed until I met her. So in the next few minutes, she's going to be talking to us about how to contribute to open source as a designer, how she has been able to break through this barrier in open source contribution as a designer, something people always knew as something left for programmers, but she was able to scale through as a designer and has been making waves both nationally, and she has been internationally recognized as well as a major key player in the open source community in Africa. So thank you, Peace Ojeme, for joining us in today's broadcast. And you'll be having the floor for the next few minutes, and we can't wait to learn from your wealth of knowledge in the open source system. Thank you very much for joining us, Peace.
Thank you very much, Amarachi, for that introduction. So I want to know, like, how many people are currently listening to us now. If you're here, can you just say hi on the chat? Thank you, Onyekachi. For those of us who are currently here, can we say hi? Because I like talking to people, and I like knowing that there are people who are listening to what I'm saying. Okay, I think we have just Onyekachi. Can everyone hear me? If you can hear me, can you say hi on the chat? Okay. Okay. Awesome. My name is Peace Ojeme. People know me as Perry. I think my formal name is beginning to go into extinction because people normally don't know me as Peace, but my formal name is Peace, and I just prefer to be called Perry. I'm a product designer who work with a couple of organizations, but primarily I've been very focused on OSCAR, Open Source Community Africa, and I've been the design lead since last year, I think, or last 2 years. What we do at Open Source Community Africa is to advocate for open source, but at the same time tell people that you can actually contribute to open source not just as a developer or as someone who contributes to code, but you can also contribute as a technical writer, as a designer, and even as project managers and any tech skill you can think about generally. So that's basically what we do at OSCAR. We just try to bring that inclusive community right into place and tell them that, oh, open source is not just for this group of people, but everyone in the tech space can actually find a place for themselves to actually contribute to open source. And one very big problem in open source is the open source design, which we are going to be talking about today. I don't have a slide, so I'm going to try to make this as conversational as possible. How many of us here on the section live here, how many of us are actual designers? Like, we're product designers, UI UX designers, graphics designers, UX designers, researchers, anything related to design? Can we say I? Like, if you're a designer, just say I. Just type I on the chat. Like the letter I. IJKI. If you're a designer, just type I. Then if you are a developer with us, can you type D? Letter D, developer D. Sorry, I have to always do this just to be sure that I have people following me. Okay, I can see we have a lot of, whether you're a junior, whether you started today, me, I'm also a junior designer. So you started today, you just have interest in design, you've not actually started designing, just type I. Then the developers, okay, I'm seeing that we have more number of developers than designers. Okay, now for this singular reason, I would like us to start from the number of designers that actually know about the fact that they can contribute to open source, and then the number of designers that actually bring themselves out to actually contribute to open source. For the past couple of years, 2-3 years, the design space in Africa, using Nigeria as a case study, has been growing really fast, and we've been having a lot of people dive into design, a lot of people come into product design, UI, UX, graphics. We have a few researchers. I think that's one aspect of design that we don't have a lot of people in Africa actually focusing, in Nigeria actually focusing. We find more of UI, graphics, and the rest of them. And the past 3 years, we've had a very great increase in the number of designers who actually come to the space. But the challenge that we face in the open source world is that a lot of designers, local designers or international designers, generally just have this misconception that open source is basically just contributing code. And if you're not contributing as a developer or as someone who can write code, you're actually not actually contributing to open source. And I think that is one barrier that Oscar and many other open source organizations have been trying to break for the past couple of years, and which is now finally leading us to talking about open source design here today. So as designers, generally, we have this, I wouldn't say general misconception, but I would say that most of us basically are always confined to our space. If you look at the developer space, developers learn more, developers do more by sharing. But designers, we are kind of like always confined to our own particular space. So designers in a particular organization only communicate with designers from that organization and share design materials within that organization. And I think that is one of the major problems that the design community, especially the open source community, is facing, because learning design from scratch, you don't develop that habit of sharing. Developers, unlike designers, why they start learning that, oh, you can actually push some changes to GitHub, people can come fork it and update the GitHub repository. They learn this collaboration while they're actually learning how to code. But that is quite different from the design angle. And that is why you see that a lot of designers grow into the design space without the knowledge of actually sharing, or without the knowledge of knowing that they have to actually volunteer to some open source organizations, or there are some open source projects that actually need design contributions. So I think that is one conversation that we need to start having as designers, how to be more open with our learning process, how to be more open with our designs, and how to find more organizations that actually accept open source design contribution. That is one of the challenges as open source designers. Another challenge we face in the open source space for designers is that most of these organizations that actually accept contributions from developers do not have that flexibility to actually accept open source design contributions. So they are mostly always focused on the technical aspect of their products and forget that, oh, there are little things that designers can actually come and contribute to, and they just forget to pay attention to those things. That's another one. Another big challenge that the open source design space has is with the tooling. So with GitHub, a developer can just go contribute to a project. GitHub count that as a contribution. But as a designer, it's quite difficult for you to track your contribution to a particular project because you don't have a tool that actually helps you count that contribution. So open source design basically is facing different challenges from different angles. from personal designers who do not know that they can actually contribute to open source projects as designers, from organizations who do not actually accept open source design contributions, and from the tooling who do not actually like have this whole channel where you can actually contributions. These are some of the most or the primary challenges that designers in open source face, and that is why it's quite difficult for people to actually like come into the space of open source design. And for those who are actually interested to come into that space, find it really difficult to find organizations that actually accept design contributions. For the designers here, can we, with the letter H, can we type H if you've ever tried to contribute to an organization as a designer, any kind of design contribution, graphics, UI, UX, research? Has there ever been a time you've tried to contribute to an open source organization with your skills? Has there ever been an attempt from anyone here? If they have, if you've ever thought about it or you've ever tried to do that, can you tell us what stopped you from doing that? Is there anyone here who has tried to actually contribute to open source projects design-wise? Graphics, UI, UX, UI, product. Okay, I see James. James said he has tried. I said Mibaka. Can you mention some of the challenges you faced? Were you successful in contributing to these organizations? I see Oluchi. Okay, I see that a lot of designers have actually attempted contributing to open source organizations. Were these attempts, were you successful in contributing to these organizations? If no, can you, in summary, mention one of the major challenges that you faced while trying to do this? While we wait for them to do that, open source design has actually been, it's actually a problem that, it's not really a problem, but it's something that a lot of people are having conversations around. We recently started the Sustain UX group that's basically focused on having conversations around how we can make organizations more open to accepting design contributions and how we can get more designers into the space of open source. So it's actually a conversation that's going around the world. It's not just in Africa, it's not just in Nigeria. It's something that is, it's a general problem basically. And the reason why that's the general problem, like I mentioned, is the organizations, basically the designers' mindset. Then the tooling is another very big problem. Okay, so Mibaka said, I tried contributing, but I didn't know where to start from. I'd have loved to see previous work in a bind to know how I can offer value. Thank you. That's one of the challenges I mentioned. Most times you go to an organization, you're actually just confused on where to start from. And that is why I talked about organizations having that problem of inclusion to designers, because basically, because they don't create that streamline for designers to come in to contribute, it becomes a problem for a designer to find that project and actually contribute to it. And that is one very big challenge that Oscar is trying to bridge with the designers here to some organizations out there who are actually looking for design contribution. Chachi said that's a she, right? Yeah, she was confused basically on how to start contributing to design to open source projects as a designer. So basically, I'm going to try to use my experience to give an example or one way designers can actually contribute to open source. And then I'm going to be sharing some materials from other designers who've actually come together to actually like write articles and write bullet points on how to actually contribute to open source as a designer. So for me, when I came into the space of design, I actually started learning technology from the whole experience of collaboration and volunteering and open source. I started off contributing to open source with Sugar Labs. Some of you who know me attach me to Sugar Labs as an organization. Yes, I started off contributing to open source from Sugar Labs. As at then, Sugar Labs actually is an organization that's very tricky when it comes to design contributions. You don't know where to start as a designer. You actually don't know what to do as a designer. You have to sit down, make a lot of research, and then start discovering where you can help the organizations. Then you start writing proposals as to what and what and what you want to do as a designer. There is no certain path. The same way they have for developers, you have to, these are the open issues, this is this, this is that, this is that. There's nothing like that in the organization. And I think it's a very common thing for a lot of open source projects. They don't have that step-by-step method you have to follow as a designer. So what I did was I started out with a background research on the organization in general. I knew what I wanted to, things I wanted to do as a designer, but I know that I can't just go in there and start making my suggestions on things that I needed them to change or things I needed them to consider changing. So I had to make this whole long background search. Then little by little, I started dropping in my inputs before I actually started doing some visual design changes. I started just dropping in inputs on experience design, the product, the flow, the user flow and stuff like that. And for you to be able to do that, you actually have to have an adequate knowledge of that organization. So one step or one very important thing you have to do as a designer who is looking for an open source project to contribute to is, once you find that open source project you want to contribute to that might need design contributions, try to make a proper research on that organization and what they do, what their product does, a proper research. Once you have this research done, you can actually have some little ways you can actually like contribute to. And one thing I've noticed in some organizations is that when you come as a designer and you just want to change something, so let's say you go to an open source project and you notice that their website, let's say you want to contribute as a UI designer, you notice that their website is not flashy enough, because most times these open source organizations are mostly made up of very high-end technical people, and you just want to come and tell them that, oh, you need to change this website, it doesn't look good. That's not enough reason for them to allow you to work on their website, because there are actually a lot of things that they put into consideration. Like Sugar Labs, they use JKL. So the first suggestions I had for the website required people to use other languages that are actually very heavy, and it's not easy for other people to just come and contribute if you don't know the stack. So those are the kind of questions they were asking me. The first question was, how do we maintain the new website that you're suggesting with this particular stack? This particular stack is actually known by a few people. So how do people come and maintain it? So those are the things you need to research as a designer. So for designers who are trying to contribute to open source, especially for UX designers, UI designers, or product designers, you really have to understand that project from both the designer point of view and then the developer point of view. You have to give them a reason why you want to change a particular thing. I'll give you another experience. So one time like that, that was last year or last 2 years, I suggested a change on the main Sugar. So what Sugar Labs does is we work on this OS, operating system for kids, called Sugar. So I actually suggested just a little design change in the Sugar platform itself. And the first question that I was asked by an experienced technical person was, how do I plan to involve those who are colorblind? On a normal scenario, before I made that suggestion, even after I made so much research, I did not think about that at all. So I had to go back and make more research. And I realized that the changes I was suggesting to be made on that particular project at that particular time did not actually solve the problem of involving those who were colorblind. What was there before on the wiki had this whole broad explanation as to the type of audience that they wanted to accommodate with that particular platform. So for someone who is trying to contribute as a designer into an organization that does not really have a part for you to contribute as a designer, you have to carefully make your background research on that organization to know what you need to suggest. And because design is not something that a lot of organizations just openly accept, we designers have to approach open source design projects carefully and with extra patience. We have to okay. We have to always try to, when we are trying to approach a project, do not expect the organization to just accept your changes with open arms, just like that. Be ready to always work on the little ideas you have. You can start with, for those graphic designers, it's a little bit easier for you because you can just check for some marketing areas where organizations might need maybe a flyer to post on Twitter or a website header or something that you could just do really fast. But for those of you who are actually trying to make contributions to the actual project itself, the first thing you need to do is to make a proper background research on the organization. Then you need to make a proper research on the product. And one very common thing I've noticed with this open source, especially the very old open source project, is that they have design guidelines. So to contribute, you have to actually understand the design guidelines properly. So for you to come and start making your suggestions, you should make suggestions that are in line with their guidelines. You have to first understand the guidelines, first understand the project, first make your full research before you start making contributions. And do not expect to just get into an open source project and then just make this very big change. That's something that a lot of organizations, from my experience, always shy away from. So be ready to get into an organization in contributing to open source as a designer gradually. You could start with the nav bar on the website. I think we can do this and this and this. And that's one very common thing with open source projects as well. When you're suggesting your design changes, because one thing that we don't understand is that design changes doesn't just affect only one particular part of the organization. Let's say you're trying to rebrand their website. You're changing a lot of things on their website, and that's a whole section of the organization, the whole marketing team. So you actually have to work with the marketing team to make sure that, this is in line with their vision and their mission at that particular time. So as designers, you have to take extra caution in contributing to open source. Moving forward, I'd like to share an article that was written by Victory. Can I comment? I'm not sure I can actually drop a comment here. So I'm just going to share it with Amarachi so she can drop it. So this article was created by Victory. She kind of like listed out the processes of how you can actually contribute to open source as a designer. First, you have to find your so one thing that I think a lot of organizations are currently doing is, when you go to GitHub and you have several issues, and then you have tags or labels attached to these issues, GitHub or GitLab, or I think Bitbucket also have that. You have several tags attached to that issue. Some organizations, basically, they create design issues. That's a recent thing, which is actually very good. So you can actually just go to an open source project's GitHub page or GitLab page and search for issues that tag design or issues that tag UI or UX. Different organizations have the different of categorizing their projects. So when you go an organization you're actually interested in contributing to, and they have design issues on GitHub, the first thing you just need to do is find those issues that are on GitHub and then try to contribute to them. I think for those of you who have contributed to OSCAR, I think you'll be very familiar with this method because that's actually what we do at OSCAR. What we do is we go to GitHub, we list out issues related to design with the tags, so you can easily just sort out those issues. But not a lot of organizations do that. So you might not find that always in different open source projects. So sometimes you literally just probably have to write an email proposing a change in the product, and that could start the conversation. Some persons just have contact person. So for Gnome, for those of you who know the Gnome project, they have a very standardized design guidelines that you can go through, and then they have contact persons you can actually send an email to that you want to contribute to this project. These are your suggestions. And even at that they have those contact persons, you can also find Gnome design project on GitLab. I'm going to share a link to. You can find Gnome issues there as well. Then OpensourceDesignnet, I don't know if we've all heard of that, has a section on their forum where you can find open source design jobs. It's just jobs. It means that here, what they do is they list out design issues from different organizations that accept design contributions, put it on their platform. You can find a paid design gig there. You can find some who are just grants. So you just like do it because you want to actually contribute to it, like a potential designer. Then there's this article written by Fox. For those of us who are actually interested in open source, I know we've all heard the name Fox. She wrote this trend as to how you can also contribute as a designer. Yeah. Okay. Can you share the links with them? So basically, as a designer, the first thing you need to do, or you need to know, or the mindset that you need to develop is you cannot just walk into an organization and just start randomly making design contributions if that organization does not really accept design contributions. So you have to first make a background search of the project you're trying to contribute to, understand it properly, then start making your design suggestions gradually. As a designer in open source, you need to actually exhibit extra patience more than a developer, because for some reason, or for some good reason, because of the mindset that developers has developed over the years about collaboration, they figured out an easy way out to actually like collaborate with a lot of developers around the globe and then measure their contributions. But unlike that, for designers, we literally just have to like, for organizations that don't really like have that part, you have to basically create that part. And for you to create that part for yourself, you have to first start with the little bits. Do not expect to just get to an organization and make a whole lot of change. Start from the little bits that you can. Find open source projects that accept design contributions. For those of them who already have a part as to how you can contribute as a designer, which is very good, you can start with those. Start contributing to little issues that they create on GitHub, on GitLab. Some of them use Bitbucket, but I'm not really sure of organizations that use Bitbucket. But mostly you can find them on GitHub and GitLab. Find one, try to contribute to it, try to communicate with the people in the organizations, try to start conversations. It's always advisable to start conversations around the design changes you want to make, so you don't end up designing a whole page and then have someone come and tell you that these changes are not needed. That's going to be more heartbreaking than actually having conversations. So if you start the conversations, you know the direction to take as a designer. It's easier for you to avoid heartbreak in the end of the day. I also want to ask a question. Has anyone here successfully been able to contribute to an open source design project before? Is there any of us here who have actually successfully contributed to open source design projects in the past? Can we say hi if we have? Okay, so I'm not sure that anyone has. So like I said, if you want to contribute to open source projects, not a lot of organization actually accept design contribution. That is also a challenge that people are working from within the organization to actually solve. That's one challenge. Then as designers, you have to build the mindset of open designs, and you have to be open to actually contribute to organizations who actually accept design contributions. So the first thing you need to do is find an organization around you that actually accepts design contributions. Try to contribute to some of the open issues. If you find an organization that needs design contributions but does not have a pathway on how a designer can contribute, you can start an email trend asking that you want to actually fix a particular issue that you think is a design issue. And the thing is, open source projects actually always have people who would reply to you at every point in time. So once you send the email, there's always someone there who would actually like send you a reply, and then that reply leads to the next thing you need to do. Find an organization, try to contribute to an organization. Another thing I wanted to talk about is around the designer mindset. So when I started talking, I mentioned that the reason why it's easier now for developers to actually contribute to open source is because over the years, they've created this habit of sharing. They've created this habit of collaboration. That is why you can just wake up, go to GitHub, find the project, fork it, and then do whatever you want to do with that particular project. That's something that we do not have. That's a culture that we do not have as designers. And one other we can help the design community in general, both in open source and the general design community, is to start thinking in a way that we can create open designs. I saw a tweet from the Chakra guy. I've forgotten his name, but I think it's one direction that I think that designers should start having conversations around. So you can start creating open designs. It's something that Figma recently added to their product a couple of months ago. For those of us who use Figma, it's called the community part, where you can find um, resources from a lot of designers around the world. You can download and reuse and update. I think these are things that designers should start building their mindset around. That would actually help us to start thinking about collaboration and then start improving the open source design space in general. I thank you very much, but I'm also open to questions. Questions.
All right, thank you very much, Peace, for that wonderful session. Please, if you have any question, kindly drop them in the comments. I'll be reading them out so that Peace can be taking some of them. We have room for a few questions, yes. So please be fast about it. Write your questions. All your questions concerning design in open source or contributing via design to open source projects, kindly ask them now. Peace is here to take all of them. Okay, so I have three major things. I'm not a designer, but I got three basic things from this talk, which is number one, before you make any contribution to an open source project, you have to make deep researches about the organization and about the product as well, because contributing to open source as a designer, you're going to be changing a whole lot of things about the design. Like, you're basically communicating what that project or what that organization is about. So open source as a designer is a key determining factor, yeah, in most organizations. And I guess that might be the reason why some organizations are very skeptical about adding open issues via design. So that's my two key takeaways. So if you have any key takeaway, feel free to share them on your social media handles while I give a few minutes for taking questions. So I'm still anticipating your questions. I'm going to wait for a few minutes, then I'll close that opportunity. So if you have a question, please drop them now. So while we wait for the questions, If you do not want to ask your question publicly here, you can always reach out to Peace via her Twitter handle at Peace Ojeme. That's Peace_Ojeme. You can send her a DM concerning any question you have about contributing to open source as a designer. I know her DM is open and she'll be taking in any question you might have as regards to that. So we have a question here, Peace. It's from Onyeka Chukwinet is asking, are they usually paid contributions or must they be voluntary? Are there paid open source contributions for designers, just the same way we have for developers, or you have internships like Outreachy or Google Summer of Code? So do we have something like that for designers? And if they are paid ones, what are their pricing like?
Okay, yeah. So we actually have some organizations actually attach payments to their contributors or to their design issues, and some it's really just voluntary. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to share the link again. If you go to the OpensourceDesignnet, what they do in the job section is they list out different organizations that need design contribution, both paid and voluntary contributions. So for the prizes, there is no one prize to a particular contribution. You can have a design. If you open the link, the first design project there is for a brand visual design. Basically, once you get in communication with the organization, then they can tell you to pay for that particular, get a paid design contribution, and you can also get like voluntary contributions. But there is no like one standard. There's no standardized price for getting paid or rewarded for your work.
Okay, thank you very much, Queenette. I hope that answers your question. So in absence of any other question, thank you very much for Peace. You can now exit from the stage, from our virtual stage, and thank you once more for joining us in this session. And thank you to everyone for joining in Peace session. I do hope you learned one or two things and you're going to immediately start implementing most of the steps and tips Peace has just shared concerning how to get started with contributing to open source projects as a designer. Don't forget that today is the day one of our 3-day webinar where we'll be discussing how to contribute to open source projects beyond code, how to contribute to open source projects as a non-programmer. And today we just got started with Peace Ojeme, who just talked to us about how to contribute to open source as a designer. In the coming days, which is Thursday by 5 p.m. and Saturday by 5 p.m., we're also going to be welcoming here, the same venue, two outstanding speakers who are also going to show us other aspects of contributing to open source. I definitely want to know if hosting an open source project webinar is also part of contributing to open source. So if you also want to know this with me, you want to know if what I'm doing right now is part of contributing to open source, do join us on Thursday by 5 p.m. on the next session in this webinar, this 3-day webinar. Thank you very much once again to every one of you that made out time to join us. You can feel free to follow our social media handles for updates on the event. Follow She Code Africa on Twitter and follow Open Source Community Africa, that's OSC Africa, on Twitter as well. You can also feel free to join our communities via the links that will be dropped in the comment sections. And feel free to interact, ask your questions, float our DMs with your questions. We will answer all of them. We can't wait to have you all getting started with contributing to open source as designers. And I hope that this event is going to be birthing many more conversations around open source designs and many more conversations around the best way to fit in as a designer in open source. Thank you all very much for joining us in this very short webinar. And don't forget to keep safe, and till Thursday by 5 p.m. Bye.